Super excited to be sharing this with you. This is a live session that I did. In my opinion, the best overview of cloud tech I've ever done. You can learn tools like Zapier, Airtable, RPA, but what are the right situations to use them? It's one thing to know the tool, but how do you pick the right tool for the job? That's what this session dove into. It's the first week of a 8-week series I did to actually get you hands-on with these tools. We've talked about them enough. Every conference you go to, RPA this, cloud that. Here we actually learn and use the tools. This is a session we did privately within my accountant community that we're now releasing for free, and it's even CPE eligible. Check out the links below. Lastly, got more CPE eligible content like this in the works. Subscribe to my newsletter below, and you're gonna get notified anytime that stuff drops. So without further ado, this was the first week in my tech workshop series. Everything you need to know to be a cloud-enabled accountant. So big days here. This is week one of the tech workshop series we've been talking about for a long time. So let's dive in. We're talking kind of high level. What does the automation landscape look like? This is the only week where we're not going to be up to our elbows in a tool the entire time learning a tool. So this first week is what are kind of the foundational things you need to know to understand how those tools work, why they matter, and why they should be a part of your business. Okay, quick icebreaker to get you comfortable with Miro. Why don't you guys tell me where you're joining us from? So with your pointer, that means you're gonna have a little arrow that looks like this. Grab a pin on the bottom left-hand side here from the corkboard, and I'm gonna stick it in Oregon because that's where I'm at. So I'm expecting Texas, a whole bunch of Texas for some reason. Seems like half the people that introduce themselves are from Texas. This is the beauty of Miro. You get people drawing things, and it can become a bit of a dumpster fire. Okay, so you've moved to pointer now, most of you. One more thing. I'm going to pull you over to the next board. What are the reasons you're attending this workshop? So you can grab a Post-it note on the left-hand side here, and then double click and say, I had to present it. So most of our workshops are going to be a mix of working in the tool versus doing kind of physical, like everybody together kind of things like this. Webinars are great, but man, I get sick of webinars. And so to me, like having something you can actually engage with for a full hour is much more interesting. To get out of my comfort zone, I'm an API noob, a couple of circles, still learning Miro, that's all right, you know, to learn cool stuff. Learn new tools, meet like-minded professionals. That was mine. Learn from others in the industry, learn new things. Pretty cool. Feel free to explore, go draw circles if you want to draw more circles. There's no harm there. So 8-week series, first one here. We're talking automation landscape. The beauty I think of Realize is that it's a bunch of practitioners. It's not coming from a vendor with a specific goal in mind. So what I'm interested in doing is getting back to kind of like first principles thinking. So like what are kind of the core rules that we're all playing by that are going to dictate what the tech landscape looks like going forward? You know, the whole like doom and gloom narrative, and then the counter narrative of no, you'll never go away. Like I'm so sick of that. Let's just look at, you know, abstracting from our vendors that we like and the tools that we like to something bigger than that. What is the tech landscape that they're working within? Where's that landscape going? And if we're aware of where it's headed, it's not an intimidating thing. And to take that a step further, you can even be proactive about where it's headed. So that if you're already there, when your clients start getting there 3 to 5 years from now, you're already making hay there, and you can advise them on how to adopt these new tools, that sort of thing. So this is a little more abstract in that sense, but that's the value of it, I think, is when you understand what's happening, it's not something to be afraid of. Agenda. So today we're going to talk about the why of what we're doing. We're going to talk fundamentals from a very, very high level. Technologies. What are the core technologies that not only we can leverage, but that, you know, our vendors leverage right now? Having an understanding of those. By the end of this 8 weeks, you could go out and make a hub doc or make a practice ignition or something like that. It doesn't mean it's a good idea, but understanding how those things work mean you can fill in the gaps where your clients have special needs or where you see an opportunity for your client base. And then lastly, in practice, what does this actually look like in your firm? We could talk about tech all day long, but where does the rubber meet the road? How do you do this in a team environment? And how do you do so responsibly from a security standpoint and all that stuff? 3 slides on why Managing change. A lot's changed in our profession in the last 40 years. From the first time we're putting accounting on the computer in the mid 80s with, Quicken, DOS-based, that sort of thing. There have been some big, steps that are fundamental changes for the profession. Accounting in the cloud, being one of them. And it's helpful to look back on those to recognize what people said when those things first came about. If you remember your first experience with those tools, it probably wasn't a positive one. It took a long time for those tools to get to a point of maturity where they were usable. And honestly, the issue with cloud adoption now is probably still just that. People had a negative experience with those tools in the past, and so they haven't adopted them, or they look at those tools in a vacuum and not the value of the integration of the cloud as a whole, but they look at that tool in a vacuum and compare it to the tool they use right now, and maybe it's not better in a vacuum. It's helpful, I think, to look at each of those stages and say, what were people saying then versus what do we know now? At that same stage, people were saying, well, it's never going to be secure enough to put accounting in the cloud. You can never do that. So here, I think what we're looking at is realistically kind of the next iteration of what the profession looks like when you get to the point where everybody can build their own tooling in the cloud and develop their own simple software. I think that fundamentally changes the tools that we use and how we approach problem solving. Now, the underlying progression here across the years has been simplification. So from your very low level machine code to here's how the circuits work on this piece of hardware, to the level of programming above that makes it accessible for developers, to the level above that makes it even more accessible. It's enabling more people to be developers. And this has always kind of been this sort of inevitable march from the early days of computing to where we are now. So by extension, the inevitable endpoint there is we're going to get to a point where you and I can build software. And so when you get to that point, I think that pretty fundamentally impacts how we advise and what a service business looks like, because I think you no longer have this notion of these big product companies where they sell products that everybody uses and these service companies that just do services. The early 2010s, something absurd like 95% of small businesses that had an accounting platform were using QuickBooks. We're going to look back at that, and that's going to be nuts. To think that the nuance and the differences between all those small businesses were being shoehorned into a single tool, I think that's going to seem kind of crazy in retrospect. So if the inevitable destination is anybody can build software, fundamentally, you got to stop and think, okay, how does that impact what I do? And how does that impact how I can help my clients? We talk a lot about commoditization because I think the narrative around accounting outwardly is that it's putting numbers from here to there and it's something that's ripe for, automation. And there's aspects of it that are. And so we've seen this with bookkeeping, QB Live coming out and kind of setting the price for bookkeeping now. And there's a lot of things that QB Live won't do well, but it will get better over time. It's just like when TurboTax came out and there was the initial reaction of, well, there goes tax preparers. It's going to do some stuff well, but it's going to get better over time. There's kind of this inevitable march towards commoditization for these things. That's just going to happen over time. And so we're always trying to stay ahead of that. But are you just ahead of it, kind of just barely surviving? Or are you doing things that are taking advantage of what's possible to where commoditization really isn't even part of the conversation? So if you're the one looking at, here's the tech landscape now, and you're building on that, and you're kind of one of one for your clients, you're giving them specific solutions for their problems, they're never going to look at, the QB Live or the whatever the next thing is that comes out that could commoditize you. If what you do is unique, then there is nobody else like you. And so you set your own price. There is no risk of commoditization. I think human nature is to listen to the people that will say, you'll be safe, and just kind of trust that. I think that kind of misses the point. The point is it's an opportunity, I think, if you engage in it. So lastly, looking towards productization. There are an absurd number of SaaS companies that are launching every single day, hundreds every week. It's because there's a huge demand there. I mean, COVID has has accelerated web adoption by 3 to 5 years easily, I think. But also because building SaaS tools is easier than it's ever been. Outwardly trying to get an understanding of what's the problem I'm trying to solve, and they build that from scratch and try to go from 0 to 1. As opposed to all of us, we have service businesses, and we have a very intimate understanding of what the problems of our customers are. Now, where's the easier place to build a successful product? In a vacuum where you don't have any customers, where you have to get attention somehow on the internet, or inside of your successful business where you already have trust that you can leverage and you have a deeper understanding of all of your customers' problems than anybody else does. You have those intimate conversations with business owners and you know exactly what they need. That's a really exciting opportunity. We're getting away from this binary notion that you're either a service company or you're a product company. That's, to me, the excitement of where the landscape's shifting. Right now, for most people, it's just an issue of know-how. They don't know the tools to make it happen. And so that lack of know-how is getting in the way of building products that can generate passive income, differentiate you from other firms. You build your own product, there is nobody else like you at that point. That, to me, is a really exciting aspect of where the tech landscape is headed. The fact that anybody can build bespoke solutions, and really the perfect people to build those bespoke solutions are the people that have a deep understanding of those problems. Okay, let's head to the chalkboard. Fundamentals. Technical people will absolutely die at my explanation of these things. But I think the great news for us is in 2020, you only really need a high level understanding of what's happening, because the tools we can leverage are taking care of the ugly stuff behind the scenes that we don't want to have to wrangle ourselves. So this is how the internet works in one slide. Not really, but this is what you need to know. So fundamentally, your computer, your phone, your dishwasher, it's making a request of a web server, and the web server is sending back a response. So Google, we make a request of a web server at this address, google.com, and it displays the response from that web server in this box down below. In reality, that response is a bunch of really ugly code that we don't want to look at, but the browser knows how to handle all that stuff. So fundamentally, that's all you're doing when you use a web browser. You're requesting something from a server at an address, and they give it back to you in a format that the browser expects. And whether it's browsing the web, whether it's making an API call, fundamentally, that's what we're doing, is we're just sending a request to a place. That thing that holds the data gives us that information back. APIs are at a very basic level what we just talked about. It's defining a standardized way for two systems to talk to each other. So Intuit has all of your QuickBooks Online data sitting on a server in a standardized format. Intuit designs the language that you must use to request information from that system. So every time you add a bill to bill.com, bill.com has a clear way to understand what Intuit wants, if it's going to push a bill back to QBO, and they talk back and forth via that API. It's literally as simple as that. So let's look at Xero's API, and you can actually see the documentation yourself to understand how it works and what's possible. This is Xero's accounting API. So let's look at accounts. These are all of the elements that belong to an account. It's all of the kinds of things that you would expect. So an account code, the name, the type of the account, the bank account number if it's a bank account. These are all things that you can access via Xero's API. So you make a request at an address, and it responds with data in a format that you would expect. Once you've got your head around what APIs can do, you're not subject to whatever native integrations your vendor is going to build out for you. So your vendor is going to build out a finite number of direct integrations, and that's always going to be a limiting factor. You know, if your client comes to you and says, man, it'd be really helpful to see all of my bank account balance, all of my bank account balances, you know, in an SMS or an email or something every single day. The first place to look is, okay, I've got this accounting platform that already has bank feeds set up. Can I get the data out of there? Zapier doesn't let you do that. Xero's API, I actually don't think lets you get bank balances, but QBO's does. So the first place to look is you can actually go in and look at the API documentation yourself and say, is this something that's even possible on this platform? the tools that we use as gateway tools to APIs like Zapier are touching on a tiny, tiny fraction of what's possible with these APIs. So it's worth understanding and just knowing how to read an API to see what's possible, because there's all sorts of great use cases for how you could glue this little thing together. It takes 10 minutes and you could do automated reporting on that. There's all sorts of opportunities. So where most people will get tripped up is making the API call itself. And that's something that we're going to work on throughout the workshop. So QBO's actually got a fantastic API now. One cool thing that they do in their API documentation is if you're logged into your account, you can actually explore API calls with real data. So if you log in here and you select a company, it'll actually populate this with, the unique identifiers of that company and, an example account or something like that to help you visualize exactly what an API call would look like there and what format the response would come back in. So they're doing a really cool thing there where it's honestly, it's making it even more accessible for people like you and I. Taking kind of a step back from there, we're headed towards kind of what people are calling the API economy. So we think of APIs as all of our cool tools that we like are backed by an API. But APIs are so much bigger than that. So you can find these giant lists of APIs that are out there. There's, I don't know how many APIs, a lot for everything you can imagine. Here's a cocktail API. We're headed towards this kind of API economy, because if you think about what happens when anybody can build software, the issue then is what data can I get access to in a standardized way? I don't want to go out and look out the window to figure out what the weather is every day. It would be great to have an API for that. So now we have a whole bunch of companies where all they do is they're just an API, and you can plug into those APIs and do whatever you want with them. What are the APIs out there that you could leverage to do things? An API that will merge PDF files for you, pull stock prices. All that stuff is fairly trivial these days because the APIs that we're able to leverage are getting more and more powerful. And so once you understand how to interface with an API, you're opened up to this huge kind of promise of everything that can be served up via an API. We've got our bubble of the accounting apps and APIs that we normally work with. But what else is out there to kind of turbocharge my workflow in terms of, saving files to the Dropbox API or all the different things that are kind of a part of your workflows. Okay, webhooks. How do you trigger an action to happen in a given set of circumstances? So whenever this specific thing happens in a program, you need to set off this other set of steps. So an example, Stripe. When you sign up for a Realize membership, I'm able to call a webhook whenever a new subscription is created. Somebody creates a new subscription, you go out, your member name gets added to an Airtable base, your authentication link is set up, it's then emailed to you, and you're added as a member to the Circle community that we use. So webhooks are your way of triggering an action. They could be called just a recurrence every day at a certain time or something like that, every minute, every hour, or they can be called based on a set of circumstances. So webhooks are something we're going to use quite a bit over the coming 8 weeks. It's a way of triggering a kind of workflow that you've designed. And lastly, what about situations where there aren't an API? So this is all fine and dandy for our cool web connected systems, right? Like your QBOs of the world. Wouldn't it be great if all of the data out there lived in something like this? The reality is it doesn't, especially if you do tax. Good grief, none of that stuff is accessible in any sort of useful way. There are tools now to bridge that. So if the legacy tool you're working with is banging rocks together, we now have tools that can serve as the middleware between that legacy tool and everything that an API can provide. So something we're going to spend 1 week on in this workshop series is robotic process automation. It basically lets you create bots on your desktop to do standardized things in an automated way. If you think about the power of being able to liberate data from your legacy tax systems and plug them into everything that you can do on the web, that's really, really powerful. So it used to be that the power of the things that we could build ourselves was limited by what we could get access to. But that's not really the case anymore. we've got kind of that middleware so that even those legacy tools that have this captive data that's really valuable, but that data is captive to that system, that stuff can now be set up in your own API. And you can connect it to do different things with it, to trigger automations, emails, that sort of thing. So this is kind of like the last piece of really being able to build whatever you want in a bespoke way, because no data is really beholden to a specific system anymore. Okay, what are the actual tools for the job? We're going to talk about 6 of them. They all have varying levels of durability. And so that's always a really important thing to think about. You know, we just talked about robotic process automation. When some people first saw that technology, they're like, whoa, cool, you can automate stuff on the desktop. I'm just going to automate everything I do in QBO and basically everything I do all day long. That's a really bad idea, because it's not a durable way of automating something just by clicking around on your desktop, because there's a lot of things that can happen there, from a program needing to update to all sorts of things like that will make it so that thing that it tries to click right there isn't there anymore. So you got to think about, of all of the options you have for different tools to enable automation, what is the right tool for the job? And so at a high level, we're going to touch on each of these. And for most of these, actually all but one of them, we're going to spend at least one dedicated week looking at it with an off-the-shelf tool. So databases, this is kind of the place to start. So the world really runs on databases. The back end of virtually everything we use is hosted by a database. And that's not always an easy thing to see outwardly. But being able to see the world in terms of databases really opens up the possibilities of the types of things that you can build. So here's a really, really basic example. It looks just like a spreadsheet, right? That could be a list of your team members or something like that. But most things aren't that linear. Most things aren't that straightforward. So for example, this Miro canvas is backed by a database. It's very abstract, right? Like that's not as clearly relevant as a roster of employees. But every single one of these elements, they're a specific type of an element. TEAL databases word. So it has a type, it has what are all the letters that make it up, the color of it, the X position of it, the Y position of it, how tall it is, how wide it is. All that stuff is backed by a database. And then when you hop into Miro, all that stuff is presented according to the data that's in the database. So the biggest disconnect for most people to begin to be able to visualize systems that they can build to make their life easier is having the ability to think about what they're doing in terms of databases. And so that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with Airtable. I think it's kind of no-code's kind of killer app. And all it is a pretty hip skin on databases, basically. It's a way of making databases really accessible and easy to understand. So that's actually where we're starting next week. So for each of these tools, I've scored them basically in terms of durability and ease to use. And databases, as durable as it gets, very easy to use and get your head around once you understand the differences between, say, like a database versus a spreadsheet. So databases, we're going to use a ton. Next, API connectors. I'm curious how many people are leveraging API connectors now. I know there's a lot more content going out about them, which is great. Practice Ignition, for example, has been putting on some really good Zapier webinars. But it's still important to understand what that tool is solving for you in the grand scheme of things and whether it's the right tool for the job. So fundamentally, all tools like Zapier or Integromat do is they're connecting one API to another and letting you define the steps in between. In situations where, say, something happens in QBO and you want to save something to your Dropbox or something like that, QBO is not going to have a native integration to do just that thing that you want to do and push it into Dropbox. And that's a great application for a tool like Zapier to create that custom workflow. And maybe that's something you use across your entire client base, and it saves you a bunch of time. You don't have to do that every single time. But Zapier is subject to the same limitations that your vendors are, and that there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of APIs out there. they're not going to build an integration with every single one. That being said, if Zapier or Integromat, something like that, does support the APIs of the tools that you want to use, that's a good place to start. That's your best, most reliable way to connect those systems. So after we talk Airtable, we're going to talk API connectors. That's where people are going to live for probably 50% of their time on these types of tools, because you can do a lot with them, and they are great for kind of filling in those process gaps for that one sort of unique thing you have about your process that maybe the off-the-shelf tools won't do for you. Durability, I've got that at 3 crowbars. You can still break them. APIs can change. It's still something you have to monitor. But actually, the nice thing about having a platform for API integrations is they're pretty good about logging history of runs and notifying you when there is an issue. It's not kind of a flip the switch on and forget about it and hope it works kind of thing. They're very good about escalating, some sort of issue when something doesn't go as planned. Easy to use is 3 out of 5. The big tools that are on these platforms are easy as can be, and the documentation inside of Zapier is great. The more abstract of the tools you start working with, it can be a little more guess and check, and can involve a little more troubleshooting to get it working how you want it to work. Web forms. This seems kind of basic, but it's something that's very underutilized in our profession, I think. You think about the amount of emailing we all do. Good grief. We do a lot of emailing, and that's kind of inherently inefficient because there's no structure to it. If you think about all the requests that you make for your initial request for everything we need to do your tax return, to the follow-up requests of here are the things we really need to do your tax return, to recurring requests for bookkeeping, stuff like that. So much of our profession is that ping-ponging back and forth. And that ping-ponging back and forth isn't adding value for anybody. It really isn't. You may be nicer about it than somebody else is, but that is not that's not an exchange of value that we're doing. That's just kind of a necessary evil of getting to the deliverable. And so the more you can automate that, and the more you can simplify that request process, the better. And the best way to do this is oftentimes with web forms. And we use web forms all the time, whether you realize it or not. When you set up a Amazon account, you don't send an email to Amazon and say, I'd like to create an Amazon account. Tell me more. And then somebody emails you back and says, okay, what's this and that? Let's schedule a call for next week. No, you don't. It's a standardized form that they go through, and you give them all the details that you need, or that they need to create an account for you. And we may never get there as a profession. I think what we do is a little more nuanced than that, but that's a spectrum. And we're definitely a little too far on the manual end of the spectrum. So identifying opportunities to leverage web forms, especially in high volume situations, like if there's a recurring ask of a client or of a bunch of clients. Those are great opportunities to create web forms, and the web form tools themselves are getting really good. For example, Typeform now, we can create a customized bespoke form for a client via their API. So one of the rubs with web forms historically has been, I can't use web forms because there just isn't a one size fits all approach. Well, now you can literally create a web form question by question via the API. So maybe of a set of 100 questions, 26 of them apply to this client, 75 of them apply to this other client. You can set that up in a single process to dynamically generate a custom form for that person. The beauty then is, since you've captured all that data in a standardized format, you can define what the destination for each of those data points is. So maybe you're asking for, petty cash balance, or a specific document that needs to go somewhere in your file system. If you compare the manual work of requesting that and putting it to the right place, and the risk that the staff person isn't going to put it where it's supposed to go, you compare that to just building a process that can be leveraged across your entire client base, and everything goes where it needs to go automatically. Obviously, that's a really appealing prospect. So we're going to spend a week talking web forms. As basic as it seems, there are so many opportunities for leveraging these where we're not using them right now. Durability, I gave that one 4 crowbars, pretty good. Easy to use, easy as can be. It's straightforward for anybody to dive in with that one. Okay, web scraping. So web scraping has become super accessible, very easy to understand. Web scraping is fundamentally pulling the data from a web page in a structured format. I think we've all had the situation where we're in a tool and you think, I just want this data right here. Just give it to me. But you can't do that. You got to go over to reports, and then you look through all the reports, and none of the reports are in the format that you actually want. All you want is what you're looking at on this screen. So for me, a great example of this, Bill.com. I want a report that's the pay screen, but holy smokes, other reports got awful. In our case, a lot of times we send a little rundown of upcoming bills that are scheduled to our clients, and they want to get it via email. And if I could just pull that stuff from the pay screen in Bill.com, it would be a lot easier. And that's kind of what web scraping is designed for, pulling things from a specific place very simply. So you'll see here, he's creating a property, a coin, and he selects this column and it grabs all of the items in that column. And then he adds a second property of price. All he does is click the price column, and this is a Chrome extension here. So he's got 2 properties, and then he can say view results, and it pulls all of that data off the website in a structured format. So he pulled 100 rows, 200 properties, and then if you want, you can take that file back in a JSON format, which is just a kind of a standard data format. So obviously that saves you a bunch of time as opposed to manually pulling something out of a system. And so maybe it makes sense for somebody to have that Chrome extension to be able to do web scraping for those one-off scenarios, and that probably saves them some time. The other thing you can do with web scraping is you design something like you're looking at right here, and then the service provider will actually host an API for you to get that data whenever you want it. So you can be the one to design that kind of web scraping, recipe. Maybe you want to pull that thing every day, and rather than sending somebody out to click through the motions every single time to pull all those figures from the page, that service will actually host an API for you, and you can just ask that API for the data whenever you want it. Durability isn't great because if that web page changes, oftentimes that will break the logic that kind of built that web scraping utility. Ease to use, I guess it depends on how you look at ease to use. Most of them now are Chrome extensions as kind of the starting point, and that's easy as can be. You install the extension and you click the data that you want, and it just grabs it for you. The harder part is, okay, they then have to set up an API for you, and then you have to work out a way to interface with the API. So if this is falling into a workflow that you do for all of your clients or a whole bunch of your clients, absolutely, it's worthwhile. But if it's something that you're doing one-off, it's just something to be aware of. We're actually not going to spend a week on web scraping. If you're interested in learning more about web scraping, check out simplescraper.io. It's a really easy entry point. Just have that in the back of your mind, because we've all had those situations where you're in a tool and it's like, just give me the stuff I'm looking at. This is all I want. And web scraping can be good for that. Okay, robotic process automation. This is a pretty powerful one in our industry, and it will be really interesting to see what happens here. So robotic process automation historically has been a tool for enterprise, because enterprise is in this really interesting situation where you've got all these huge companies with huge systems and SAP or whatever it is, and they are of such a size that it doesn't make sense to ever move to something else. They've kind of become so big that the prospect of changing systems is virtually impossible. So rather than ripping that Band-Aid off and having crazy amounts of data and users having to switch to a new system at once, you now have tools like RPA that serve as kind of the middleware to that legacy system, so that you can then build more robust things on top of it, automate the menial things that are happening in that system so that users aren't having to do it. And there's definitely some parallels there with our profession, because a lot of the tools that we use, we don't have the power to pull data out in an automated way. And so wouldn't it be nice to have a tool over the top that let you interface with it in a more helpful way? I think most of us have worked with those legacy, especially tax systems, from, the practice management systems that make you kind of do those inane things that you don't really want to do. This is a way to simplify that, connect it with API, and even via webhook trigger certain steps inside of a legacy system to be done on your behalf. So these tools have come a long way. UiPath is the big player in this market. They basically give you a visual way to design bots from it, recording an example set of steps, say click here, click there, enter this number here. They've made it very accessible to design these bots that can then run for you 24 hours a day. The problem until very recently has been the cost to entry for RPA has been 80 grand a year at a minimum. We've got a couple players now that are coming down market, one of them being Electronique. We're going to be working in Electronique specifically because they have a free community version. Everybody can install it. Everybody can give it a try and develop a bot, see if it's something that's for them that they can then build upon. But even if you take it past that point, we've actually got to deal with them where for basically between around $400 a month, you're going to have the Electronique platform and the ability to build an unlimited number of bots. So that's around $400 a month. But that's workshop week 6 or something like that. You're going to be able to install it for free, explore it, get your head around it and all that with no kind of cost outlay up front. So RPA has been around for a few years. What's changed in the last 6 months is accessibility for small groups like you and I. Definitely something worth exploring. We talked about this a bit before. On the accessibility spectrum, in the grand scheme of things, not that durable because things can happen on your desktop that you don't have control over. Now, these tools are getting good at that, kind of blocking out those distractions and using logic that will ensure that won't break a process. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to be as durable as talking API to API or something like that. That being said, that's not a reason to park the bus there. So I think there's people that look at all this tech and say, I really don't want to get into the business of babysitting these automations all day long. And I can completely understand that because, man, have I been there. But you gotta consider it kind of on the spectrum. So on one hand, you're doing everything manually. On one hand, you have automated or quasi-automated processes. You got to compare the two. What sort of expertise does it take to manage one versus the other? And what's the total time and cost outlay of one versus the other? You don't want to get hung up on the notion that something has to be perfectly 100% automated all the way through for it to be worthwhile, because a lot of times there's something in the middle there that is still a big step forward. So that's really where RPA is at today. And it's why I think it's worthwhile. Worth keeping in mind, it's 2020. This is the worst these tools are ever going to be. So you look at your tax suite, stuff like that, the rate of development of those tools is hilarious. These tools are growing leaps and leaps and bounds. They're getting big investment. They're hugely improving every single year. And it's a good place to hitch your wagon to in terms of thinking about the future. Last tool we're going to talk about, and this is a really interesting one. If you follow my ramblings on Twitter, you probably see me talk about this, image generation. So image generation APIs are a really interesting way for you to provide insight in an automated way. So simply put, it's an API where you on the side of that tool create some sort of design, and you plug into that API by providing the values that populate that design. So that could be anything. That could be a very basic image with only a couple amounts, could be a big long report, could be a list of KPIs, could be a bunch of things. The important thing here now is you have the ability to generate these reports in an automated way, which we could never do before. So I think the easiest way to look at this is with a couple of examples. I put this out at the 7:15 deadline. This was kind of a fun thing I did on Twitter. So I pulled all of the hashtag tax Twitter tweets back to January 1. And I created this arbitrary scoring system for everybody that had posted to the tax Twitter hashtag. It was, X points per like, X points per retweet. It was 3,000 or 4,000 people that had done it that year. I put everybody into an Airtable base, and you had a list of everybody that had been involved in tax Twitter that year. Number of points, number of tweets, all that. and I could use an image generation API to create kind of these fun little like, placards that everybody had. So I think I tweeted like the top 5, and then everybody outside the top 5 could tweet to a Twitter bot, and it would respond with a little image for them. So if they were hyper engaged, they got, kind of this encouraging card. If they weren't that engaged, then, they got kind of this thing like somebody had to bring the Capri Suns to the post game, or if there was nothing, you either never used the tax Twitter handle or the bot broke. And this was something that, in about 60 minutes, you could set up with the underlying data, and then the images could be generated on the spot, as they were requested. A little more kind of real life example for your clients is, a scorecard like this. So if you think about the normal advisory cycle, monthly KPIs, you get to a KPI result at the end of the month, there's a lot of things that happened upstream of that KPI result that impacted the result. It could be 30 employees that took actions that led to that KPI result. And the shorter you can make the feedback loop for all those people involved, the more likely you're going to steer things in a positive direction. So look at the scorecard. This is a date, a name, 3 data labels, 3 numbers, an up, down arrow, and a number of stars. So that's 10 things. So you give the API 10 things. The result is this scorecard that you could email to a person, SMS to a person, post to a Slack channel, but you can do that in a fully automated way at scale. So let's say they have 100 employees. Depending on where the underlying data for this lives, you have somebody on the client side generally upload that data. It outputs 100 of these scorecards. You could do that every single day. And you've drastically shortened the feedback loop for, a metric like that. So this is straightforward to set up. This exact thing actually is what we're going to work on in week 8. You're going to be able to do this, produce this for any of your clients that you want to. And it's a great example of how you can use a product to lean into your advisory in a really powerful way. Because what's the value of this? If you're doing this across, hundreds of employees or 5 employees, this is the kind of thing that people pay a lot of money to develop themselves. But you're the one familiar with the problem, so you're in the best position to offer the solution. It's a great example of a kind of exciting opportunity to offer a product to your clients inside of your service business. So, grand scheme of things, keep in mind the right tool for the job. Everything's on a spectrum. Some are more durable than others. And so be mindful of the fact that when you have a job to be done, consider all the options out there and what's going to be best. Really all of these, but web scraping, we're going to spend a dedicated week on. So you guys are going to be pros by the end of this. Okay. Web scraping would have been so helpful back when I had to produce bespokebill.com reports. Oh man, I feel you. How long and how difficult to set up a Miro board like this. I did it on Sunday, Adam, in, 20 or 30 minutes. This is probably the highest effort Miro board I've ever done for sure. Like if I'm having a one-on-one meeting with a client, not a chance they're getting this from me. Simple tax intake web form. Yes. And so there's definitely important considerations there about data security. What do you want to put on the form? What do you not want to put on the form? But that's a great use case. So last section, we're going to cruise through this. What does this look like in practice? Who is this tech for? Is this tech for you? Is it for your team? Is it for your CTO? Is it for your clients? I can tell you what I think. This has been a 4 or 5 year journey for me. I didn't know any of this stuff 5 years ago. It's probably made me, 4 or 5 times more productive because I've got several hundred things running in the background at any given time, working at night when I'm not working. Those things are always happening on my behalf. I'm not managing them. You think of the investment, the amount of time we spend to make these incremental realization adjustments with our teams. If you came upon something that in 2 or 3 years could make your people 1.5 times more productive, 2 times more productive, would you come to your CTO and say, here you go, you're going to be the pro on this? I don't think so. If I hired somebody tomorrow that knew all this stuff and they were twice as productive, probably not going to pay them twice as much as the other person that doesn't know this stuff. So if you ask me, it kind of feels like you're leaving those people behind if this isn't something that you don't integrate into the culture of your business. It's something that I'm doing. I'm surrounded by about 10 people now who are really good at this, who work on the cash side of my business. And they are absolutely like taking over the tax side of our business now because they know how to do things that the rest of the people in our business don't know how to do. So something to think about. Start planning how you're going to put these tools into practice today. Because if you come out of this and you're just a genius, you know all this stuff, you got all these ideas, that is a really lonely hill to die on if you're surrounded by people that don't know any of this stuff. So be thinking about that. You don't want to be the only person on call around the clock for these automations that know how to do these things. You definitely want to do so responsibly. New tech means new controls. You got to build a technical review process. A good grief for accountants, that's kind of our thing, right? So we shouldn't be intimidated by that. Always be thinking about ways to minimize third-party access and recognize most people are going to stop here. Like this is where most people kind of park the bus and they're like, this isn't for me. I don't know how to do this. It's the same group of people that were saying you can't ever put accounting in the cloud. It's not secure enough. So don't lose heart here. It's something new to learn, definitely, but man, the possibilities are huge. And at that point, it's like, so long commoditization, right? If you are one of one because you're creating solutions exactly for your client's needs, you're never going to be part of that commoditization discussion. So you're looking at leverage at a level you've never had before because this stuff works around the clock. You're looking at margins that you never would have been able to reach inside of a service business if all you're doing is manually helping people all day long. Productization is a really exciting aspect of this, passive income, and then price setting because there's nobody like you. So this 8 weeks, we're going to be focused on expertise. You're going to develop your own expertise with all of these things. And at the end of the 8 weeks, we're just going to touch on the notion of how do I build products into my service business? We're going to have one really basic example, and you'll be able to take that away from the 8 weeks. But you're really just kind of opening the door to what are the things that most of my clients need that I could give them in a really easy way that they pay for? Because they're going to pay for value, whether it's a service or product. Lastly, marketing. If we're able to unlock this level of productivity for our team, just a matter of time before all of our small business clients do it too. So if you're there now and they're starting to hear about Airtable, stuff like that, man, you're in a really privileged position to be able to be the one to introduce them to that stuff. So be thinking past the 8 weeks, be thinking ahead about what makes sense for how I start taking my clients on this journey. Maybe it's a workshop series like this, but good grief, if you had a way to make your clients twice as productive, you'd do it, right? So be thinking about that as we go ahead. That's it. So thank you for coming. Next time, we're going to be hopping into No Code's Killer app. We're going to spend an hour hacking things together in Airtable. There's going to be a Zoom link in the community, so head over there, get that Zoom link, calendar appointment, and all of that stuff. And thank you guys very much. So there you go, there's an overview. But like I mentioned, this is the only week that isn't hands-on. We're actually doing stuff live. And the next one, No Code's Killer app, and what ended up being the most popular thing in this series, Airtable. I'm gonna drop all 8 episodes week after week. So be sure to catch each of these, get some continuing education credits in the process, and be sure to get on my newsletter because I got more goodies like this on the way. Woo-hoo.